Good evening. I'm Michal Safdie from the Center for International Studies at MIT. We're delighted that you are here with us tonight at our Starr Forum entitled Darfur, Darfur. Before introducing our panelists, I would like to thank our co-sponsors. First, Boston International, a recently founded nonprofit organization that hosts events on global affairs. Boston International provides an engaging atmosphere for young professionals and graduate students to interact with and learn from today's influential thinkers and world leaders. Already they've hosted 16 events and have grown to more than 1,000 members. Our other co-sponsors who have helped publicize and or fund this event include the Center for International Studies Program on Human Rights and Justice, MIT's Amnesty International, and Physicians for Human Rights. I'd also like to thank the MIT Council for the Arts, who awarded us a director's grant, which partly funded this event as well. Lastly, I'd like to thank Artworks Projects and its founding director, who is also the curator of the Darfur exhibit, Leslie Thomas. Ms. Thomas, who is here tonight and you will hear from shortly, was extremely generous and flexible in allowing us to bring the world-traveling Darfur exhibit to campus. Finally, if you'd like to learn about upcoming Starr Forums and events hosted by our co-sponsors, we have a joint sign-up list outside in which you can leave your details. Before we start, a reminder to silence your cell phones, and after the panelists have finished speaking, we'll have a Q&A, and if you could line up in the aisles behind the mics, that would be appreciated. Now, on to introducing our speakers. First, Robert Rotberg is Director of the Program on Intrastate Conflict and Conflict Resolution at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He is also president of the World Peace Foundation. In past positions, he was professor of political science and history at MIT, academic vice president of Tufts University, and president of Lafayette College. He is the author and editor of numerous books and articles on U.S. foreign policy, Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, including China into Africa, Trade, Aid, and Influence, Worst of the Worst, Dealing with Repressive and Rogue Nations, Building a New Afghanistan, Battling Terrorism in the Horn of Africa, and From Massacres to Genocide, the Media, Public Policy, and Humanitarian Crises. Also with us tonight is Susannah Sirkin, who is Deputy Director of Physicians for Human Rights, a national organization that mobilizes health professionals to advance the health and dignity of all people through action that promotes respect for and protection and fulfillment of human rights. She has held this position since 1987, when she joined the organization's staff shortly after its founding. Previously, she was Director of Membership Programs for Amnesty International USA. She has organized health and human rights investigations to dozens of countries, including recent documentation of genocide and systematic rape in Darfur and Sudan. She's also helped organize PHR's exhumations of mass graves in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda for the International Criminal Tribunal's investigations into consequences of human rights abuses, and has helped organize work into violations of international humanitarian law in Afghanistan, El Salvador, Haiti, India, Iraq, Israel, Palestine, Kosovo, Kuwait, Somalia, Turkey, Zimbabwe, and the United States, among others. She co-developed and directed the first postgraduate course in medicine and human rights initiated at Harvard Medical School in 1992 and lectures regularly on health and human rights in medical schools and schools of public health. Finally, we have with us Marcus Bleasdale, a photojournalist and member of the Darfur Project, who is widely published in the UK, Europe, and the USA in publications such as Time, Newsweek, The New Yorker, The Daily Telegraph, Harper's, Le Monde, etc. The list goes on. Marcus has received acclaim for his work over the years. His work covering the brutal conflict within the borders of the Democratic Republic of Congo was published in his book, 100 Years of Darkness. The book is recognized in the Best Photojournalism Books of the Year 2002 by Photo District News in the USA. In 2004, he was awarded UNICEF Photographer of the Year Award, the 3P Grant, and the Alexia Foundation Grant. He exhibited in New York at Moving Walls 2005 and was awarded the OSI Distribution Grant 2005. Marcus's images have also been chosen by PDN as one of the most iconic of the 21st century. In 2003, he was named Magazine Photographer of the Year by POYI. In 2006, Marcus was awarded a World Press Daily Life Award and won the prestigious OPC Olivier Rebut Award Apology if I didn't pronounce that correctly. In 2007, Marcus was awarded a Freedom of Expression grant for his new project on our relationship with oil, and he was also shortlisted for the Amnesty International Photojournalism Awards. Now, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Robert Rotberg. Robert Rotberg.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Michelle. I'm delighted to share a platform with Susannah and Marcus, and more importantly, with the exhibit. It's the exhibit really will say a great deal about Darfur, even though Darfur is no longer in the hot news. It's still important. The conflict goes on. The genocidal years are still continuing, despite the fact that the casualty rate is fortunately much fewer. But we have not necessarily seen the last of the killing fields. We have not necessarily seen the end of Darfur in the headlines. There's much more to come, particularly if we relax and not think about Darfur and not put pressure on the U.S. government and other governments to bring the Darfur conflict to an end. You probably know that 3 million Darfuris are still displaced in refugee camps and in internal displaced camps. They cannot leave their camps very readily. They can't go back and resume normal life for fear of being raped and being killed. There is no return to normality in Darfur for the time being. There's no return to agricultural life. There's no return to villages in the short term. And as Susannah will tell us, there are continuing human rights violations. I checked today or yesterday, and the catalog of violations continues. Now, Darfur is the size of France. The same forces are battling today as they have been battling for control of Darfur for the last 6 years. The government of Sudan, directed by the National Congress Party junta, led by President Omar al-Bashir, an indicted international criminal, is still implacably opposed to autonomy in Darfur, to home rule, or to any of the other options, just as it, and I'll speak briefly about this at the end, just as it is still opposed to the fulfillment of the comprehensive peace agreement which governs the rest of the Sudan. Indeed, and we maybe will have time in the question period to talk about this, the conflicts north-south and the conflicts within Darfur are linked much more closely than most people realize. The government of the Sudan continues to use ethnic divisioning and violence as its primary strategy for holding on to power. That was its reaction to the first Darfur rebellious movements in 2003 and continues to be. They're continuing war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated in Darfur. The leading perpetrators are still the Janjaweed. They haven't been reined in. The Janjaweed marauders on horseback are still attacking camps whenever they can and making ordinary life in Darfur impossible. The combat between pastoralists and agriculturalists, between light-skinned and dark-skinned Darfuris continues, despite the fact that the light-skinned and dark-skinned people, even though they're different ethnically, all speak Arabic and all are Muslims. Now, ideally, the government of Sudan should end the combat in Darfur and withdraw all of its support for the Janjaweed. It could also end aircraft strafings and helicopter strafings of camps. It could curtail the proxy wars which it sponsors in Chad and in the Central African Republic. Now, admittedly, since the war shifted its course about 2006 and 2007, the rebel movements are more disunited than they were, and there are more of them. They are opposed to each other today as often as they are opposed to the government of the Sudan. And some of the refugee camps, some of the internal displaced camps are raided by rebels, not by the government. Nevertheless, there's no reason for us, despite the disunity in the rebel movement, to dismiss the Darfuri problem as impossible and simply forget about it. And it's also important to say that the peace process in Sudan, which is critical, I'll talk about that in a moment, is not stalled because of rebel disunity. It's not stalled simply because there are rebels out there opposing themselves as well as the government. The situation in Sudan and in Darfur is much more complicated than it was, but that's no reason to walk away from it. What is really at stake now, 6 years into the war? Mostly control over territory and resources. The government of the Sudan also continues to fear the dismemberment of the entire Sudan, the largest territorial piece of Africa. There's also the rumor and the hope of oil in Darfur. The government wants to keep its hand on that. There's prestige involved. There's commitment. There's the commitment of the junta to keep Darfur together. Now, Darfuris the original rebellion in 2003 was occasioned by the deliberate political marginalization of Darfur. That still continues. So the rebels and rebel movements still have a reason to be opposed to the government. Nothing has changed in terms of marginalization, in terms of the attempt to keep the people of Darfur away from the main line resources like oil in the Sudan. Now, the Bush administration condemned the war and called it genocide. It wrung its hands, but did very little because of Iraq and because of China. The Sudan was also assisting in the intelligence operations in Iraq. And that was one reason which held the Bush administration's hand back. Now, the Obama administration is led by persons from the very top, from Nobel Prize winners down, who all care very deeply about the tragedy of Darfur, who have all talked of antagonism to the government of the Sudan in their previous lives, and in favor of really very draconian solutions to the problem of Darfur. But the special envoy that the Obama administration has appointed to deal with the Sudan seems to understand less about Darfur than about developing relations with the government of the Sudan. Colonel Scott Gration, has made welcoming noises to Omar al-Bashir, which have been resented by Darfuris and questioned by various groups in Washington. And Colonel Gration's approach seems to be largely one of offering carrots without carrying a big stick. His approach has also been very unilateral and not been multilateral in a way that the junta that rules Sudan would understand more. So let me just give you a few ideas about what the U.S. should be putting forward as concrete proposals, which would lead to a negotiated peace similar to the Comprehensive Peace Agreement signed in 2005. One, the U.S. must insist, along with its allies, along with Europe, the European nations, and as many Arab and African countries as it can bring along, which is a tall order, include, first of all, the dismantling of the Janjaweed and developing a mechanism for power sharing at the local and national levels. Compensation for genocide is important, and support which the U.S. would be able to provide for reconstruction. But the most important thing of all these is to disarm the militias, and then to have an internationally monitored process to assemble the armed groups in camps, collect their weapons, demobilize them, and then repatriate them back into farming or pastoral areas. What the missing ingredient in all this, those are pious thoughts I've just uttered, but the missing ingredient is comprehensive security for the process. Something UNAMID, the UN and AU force combined, has not accomplished and cannot accomplish despite 17,000 men on the ground. It has very few helicopters and very little mobility and rather poor leadership. Now, another thing the U.S. must try to insist on is one peace process, not several. The Libyans are leading a peace process. The Egyptians are leading a peace process. This week in Doha, there's a peace process sponsored by Qatar, and none of these will lead anywhere. There has to be a very different kind of peace process engaged in by the leading powers of the world. There's also a problem because we, the U.S., are focusing on the 2010 election in Sudan and trying to bring Darfur into the electoral process. There isn't enough time. There hasn't been a census. There's no way of knowing who lives in Darfur or who can vote. And the people in the camps are afraid of registering for fear they will lose their land by registering as belonging to camps. So the election timetable, which Colonel Gratian is pursuing, doesn't really work. We need to help the Darfuri leaders select new leaders. One of the key leaders is in Paris and hasn't returned to Darfur for at least a decade and isn't about to in the near term. We need something which is very easy to speak about but hard to bring about. We need to engage civil society in Darfur. We need to engage the people in the camps, people outside the camps. They have been marginalized in the various peace meetings that have occurred to date. There are all sorts of questions which I won't have time to go into, but there are questions of whether Darfur should emerge from a peace process as one region or as three states at present. It was one region before 1989. Now, direct U.S. involvement is critical, so is finding a way to engage China. China is the main arms supplier to the Sudanese government. Its bullets and its aircraft contribute to killing in Darfur. It's the main purchaser of oil. It's the main support for the ruling junta. Without Chinese support, the Sudan would be a very different place, and the junta would not be as strongly in power. We may want to do something which would change U.S. policy, but would be sensible and would also help Europe if Europe did so, which is to support the ICC indictment more than has happened. Now, a comprehensive arms embargo is needed, and I have long advocated, as possibly others here have done too, a ban on overflights. This could be done very easily from a French base in Chad. It has never been attempted to simply prevent the Sudanese government from having control of airspace and therefore being able to harass refugees in camps at will and rebels at will. Now, I won't say much, but invite questions about the comprehensive peace agreement, because the other thing that's very worrying to me and should be to you is that there's a very strong possibility of a continued war north-south as well as North Darfur. The Sudanese government is violating the Comprehensive Peace Agreement every day. It has prepared a census which was laughable in the north. There's a need for a census in the south. That hasn't happened yet. There have been border violations there, and the Sudanese government is also arming proxy militias in the south against the southern Sudanese government in a way which shouldn't be permitted, and very similar to what it did in 2003, 4, and 5 in Darfur. Finally, I think my most important message is that the Sudan is ripe for renewed war on several fronts. I haven't mentioned the east, I haven't mentioned the north, but certainly north-south and Darfur continues. And it's up to us as citizens and particularly Americans to prevent the reopening of old wounds and wounds that, as in Darfur, have not been closed properly. The Sudan is a repressive regime that's fairly certain and belongs under the aegis of the responsibility to protect norm, which the UN has passed in 2005 but has not given teeth to. It's also, Sudan is clearly in violation of the Genocide Convention and the Human Rights Conventions, and it would take the actions of a divided Security Council to bring Sudan to heel, but perhaps the U.S. can do something in that regard and can build a coalition to bring about useful change for all of Sudan, and particularly for Darfur. After all, it is past time to restore stability, civility, and peace of mind to the people of Darfur. Thank you.
Thank you. So you've had a little bit of the sort of political overview, and I wanted to bring you a little closer to the ground. I know you're going to see here from Marcus and then out there incredible photographs, which I think all of them speak for themselves. But just to put some of these images into a bit of context, I wanted to just tell you a little bit about our experience through the lens of the work of Physicians for Human Rights. It's really sobering to me to think that I've now been talking about the same thing, more or less, for going on 6 years related to the crisis in Darfur. And I suspect that many of you were young teenagers even when the crisis, the latest crisis in Sudan, in Darfur in particular, first erupted in 2003 and 2004. Physicians for Human Rights sent a team to the Sudan border in 2004 when we read about the atrocities that were being committed, and our tendency is to send medical teams, investigators who have great experience gathering testimony in a scientific way, taking photographs, but also trying to get sometimes population-based information. And after several trips to the border, which were quite harrowing because this region, as you'll see, and many of you, I'm sure most of you already know this, is really one of the most arid areas of the planet, and Darfur in particular being really neglected by the Sudanese central government in Khartoum for many, many decades, has very few roads, and it is, I mean, we keep saying size of France, size of Texas. It's big, and a lot of it is barren, but it also has areas of rich vegetation, and many of the people, most of the people who have lived in Darfur for centuries have farmed under challenging conditions. There are areas where there are incredible, ingenious ways to get what you can out of land with little water. Wells are a necessity. for survival in villages that dot the landscape, but also a really harsh climate, enormously high temperatures in the hot season. When our team first went there, they traveled in temperatures of 115 to 120 degrees through dust storms with very few roads. And then, of course, when floods do come in, they fill the wadis and those roads are impassable. So life is precarious. And yet the people in Darfur that we interviewed, one after the other, men, women, children, said that their life was good in Darfur before this crisis. They had a little bit of land, they had a few camels, which is really the equivalent for us to maybe a mortgage. It's all their wealth. A family's wealth would be in the 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 camels that they had, donkeys, goats, chickens, and usually a small or larger plot of land where they would farm. Houses, very close-knit community, most of them devout Muslims. And when the bombs hit their villages and they were forced into flight, it was instantaneous. Houses on fire, Janjaweed on horseback sweeping in, very often killing any men in sight brutally, and women who did not leave quickly enough were often taken and raped, many of them gang raped. We documented, after several trips, provided what we considered to be strong evidence that genocide had been committed by the government of Sudan and their allies or their proxy militias, the Janjaweed. And our analysis was based on one of the articles of the Genocide Convention, which defines the crime, among other elements, as the intent to destroy the ability of a population to survive. And we called our first report Assault on Survival because literally these people whose villages were so brutally attacked, when they were forced into flight in that desert, they could not survive without water or food or shelter. And we have, and you probably will see pictures of how exposed people in such terrain are and were. And the government of Sudan, knowing full well what would happen when hundreds of thousands of people were forced out of their homes in this way, would not be able to, many of them, to make it to a place where they could subsequently receive food, water, shelter, and the basic necessities of survival. And in fact, for most of the subsequent years between 2003 and 2004 and now, the population of Darfur has been vastly dependent on international humanitarian assistance. Physicians for Human Rights was also able to work with colleagues in Darfur who were themselves trying to protect their own people. And one of the things that I think it's really important for us to understand is you look at some of the pictures of Darfur, you read about it in the newspapers, or you come to Darfur events, and we think of this entire people as victims, as people who are, sort of huddled refugees living in tents and hungry and so forth. And while all of that is true, there is nonetheless a population, including a population that engages professionals who are on the front lines of struggling for their own survival and their own human rights. And I was privileged finally myself to travel to Darfur in 2006, where with colleagues in Sudan and from outside of Sudan, we trained health professionals and lawyers in the documentation of torture and rape, which they were trying to do. And it was amazing to me because even as much as I had studied and learned about Darfur, when I actually arrived in Nyala, I was sort of surprised to see a kind of a thriving town in a market, people buying and selling, a tiny little DVD store that sold cassettes of Sudanese music, often lit by candlelight because the power constantly was going out. But also there we were training Sudanese, Darfuri doctors and lawyers who were struggling to try to hold their own government accountable for what was happening to them and trying to document as best they could every day, as well as the doctors trying to treat people. While we were doing 3 days of training, doctors in our session had to suddenly leave because they had to go to the hospital and provide emergency care and surgery to people who had been attacked and injured that day. And what's really horrifying to me is that as the global narrative and even our own U.S. government's narrative is saying, well, it's no longer genocide, most of the violence has subsided, and so forth. Whereas in 2006, these organizations could meet with me, and I could travel there, and I could train them, and they could have this conference with a human rights organization from the United States. Today, those very organizations are gone. They have been shut down. Their staff have been arrested or intimidated. Many of them have fled the country. And so what we know today, as we speak, about the humanitarian conditions in Darfur are lacking direct information because the frontline people who used to report to us about what was going on, like the human rights organizations, are gone. That many of the international humanitarian organizations who were providing essential life-saving aid, 13 of them were expelled earlier this year following the warrant for arrest issued against President Omar al-Bashir by the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And also, and this is less discussed and less talked about, 3 Sudanese organizations were shut down. And those are the groups that we should be most concerned about going forward, because those organizations have heroic individuals whose lives are at risk. There have been, Human Rights Watch just put out a report a few weeks ago describing in some detail the harassment of journalists, the censorship of the media in Sudan, and the suppression of civil society, which is going on as we speak. And of course, that will threaten free and fair elections going forward, as well as humanitarian assistance. We do know that there is ongoing violence. Every few weeks, there are new attacks, sometimes from the air, with bombs indiscriminately being dropped on villages, civilians killed, women raped, and so forth. I want to talk a little bit more about the crime of mass rape as a weapon in this war. We were able to document in quite some detail in an investigation we conducted last year the horrific crime of sexual violence that has been perpetrated on the women of Darfur and then continues to be perpetrated on refugees who have crossed from Darfur into Chad. As you probably know, this is one of the most disturbing kinds of crimes that occurs in war. It's awful, obviously, to be killed. It's terrible to be tortured. And rape is a crime that is usually committed, and certainly we see that in this conflict, with an intent not only to destroy the individual woman who is the victim of the rape or the subject of the attack, the object of the attack, but also the entire community. And we see how the rapes that have occurred, probably against many thousands of women, and we don't know the exact numbers, have been committed in such a way as to destroy the family, the fabric of society in very tight-knit communities. We interviewed 88 women in Chad last year. Medical doctors who were my colleagues went and spent 3 weeks on the border in one camp. And they interviewed women about their experiences in Sudan, in Darfur, before they fled, what their lives were like, and then what happened during the attacks, which they described to us in great detail, and then what happened to them as a result of their violent assault that included sexual violence. And the horror and the depression and the suffering and the stigma that these women have been exposed to is was, for the doctors who interviewed them, really almost unimaginable. And these are colleagues of ours at Physicians for Human Rights who work regularly with refugees fleeing horrific violence from all over the world. And to a person, the 3 women physicians who we sent over to collect this documentation said this was by far the worst situation they had ever seen. And many of them have traveled to some of the worst war zones in the world. I just want to tell you a little bit, maybe if you wouldn't mind, Rob, handing me that, one story of one of the women we interviewed. I'll say that that her name is I'm going to give you not her real name because we don't report in our documents their real name. But for the sake of this, we'll say that her name is Zainab. She was 18 years old. She was a single woman from the Masalit tribe. She'd lived in the camp for 5 years. And she had never told her story to anyone before talking to the physician who interviewed her. She had lived in a village called Gokor in Darfur with her mother, her father, and 4 brothers. Every morning she would get up at 6 in the morning and make tea and breakfast for her family, and then she'd go to work on her family's farm. She described her life as good, her mood as being happy most of the time, and she felt that her physical and mental health had been good. And then she said, one morning on a Wednesday, the Janjaweed came into the village riding horses. Many of the men were wearing the green uniforms of the Sudanese army. They entered the house. She says, they shot my father with a gun right in front of us in our house, and he died. We ran away. They caught me and beat me. They used sticks and horsewhips. They grabbed me and pulled my clothes. She then described how they ripped off her shirt, how they raped her, many men, one by one. She could not quantify how many. I was bleeding, she said. I was sick for 4 days. All of my body was sick. She saw her mother beaten, 3 of her brothers beaten, and 1 brother beaten and shot with a gun, but not killed, all by the Janjaweed soldiers. She reported that she had seen more than 20 young girls being raped and more than 30 killed by gunshot. Then she told the doctors, they burned our village, including our house, and took all of our animals. And so she and her mother and 4 brothers went into the forest and stayed there for 4 days. And then she described how there was no one to help, how they hid in the forest, her bruises, her pain, the swelling, and how they later encountered Janjaweed on their flight into Chad. And what's really most horrific, and what our study shows, is that now they have fled to so-called safety in camps run by the international community and international aid agencies under the auspices of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees in Chad. And these women are still being raped. When they leave the camps to collect firewood, they're subject to attack. Some of them are sexually assaulted inside the camps, and they are still not safe. And so their lives are in absolute misery, and they live in fear. And that's why we called our report Nowhere to Turn, Failure to Protect, Support, and Assure Justice for Darfuri Women. And they begged us and all of our doctors to come back here and tell their story. They said, if you do anything, just tell the world what is happening to us. If the world knew, they would surely do something. If you go on our website, www.darfuriwomen.org, you'll see this amazing manifesto that the women in the Farshana camp have put out to the world, and you can actually respond to the women there on that website. But as we've just heard, the challenges ahead for a response to protect the people of Darfur, to get appropriate aid effectively back in, to stop and disarm the Janjaweed, and to protect refugees on the Chad side as well as in the internally displaced persons camps inside Sudan is enormously challenging. And what we are lacking, above all else, is political will of the rest of the world to address the crisis in Sudan in a much more concerted, organized, coherent, and robust way. Obviously, we're supporting the International Criminal Court and its warrant for the arrest of the President of Sudan. Enacting such a warrant is obviously enormously challenging, and there's a lot of conversation about how you can do this at the same time that you're trying to negotiate a peace. Most recently, what is being discussed now is, as we heard, engaging civil society in Darfur more in a peace process. But in an environment that is so constrained, where there really is not freedom of expression or movement or a right to organize, it's very hard to imagine what that civil society representation is going to look like. And the longer the conflict has gone on, and the less able the international community has been to act to stop the violence, the more the opposition, the rebels in Darfur become dangerous, fractured, and with men in banditry who are now attacking the very peacekeepers who are supposedly supposed to be there to protect the civilians in this horrific crisis. So I don't want to leave you without hope. What has been extraordinary in the aftermath of the early days of this crisis, it has been really an incredible global movement and awareness, as I've never seen in my 30 years of working in the human rights movement, to respond. But the problem is that all of this engagement and interest and noise from the public has not managed to bring about concerted action beyond, and I don't want to minimize this, incredible humanitarian response all these years, which no doubt has kept many hundreds of thousands of people alive. I urge you to join one of the organizations that is working to campaign to put pressure on our own government to have a more coherent policy on Darfur. The Enough campaign, the Investors Against Genocide, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and our own work, the Darfur Survival Campaign at Physicians for Human Rights. There are many other organizations that are doing incredible work. It's a shame we're not more together with one or two very clear policy asks, and that's something maybe we can talk about further in the discussion. Thank you.
Good evening, and thanks for being here. My name's Marcus Bleasdale. I've been working in Darfur since 2003. I first went there in November 2003, and I've been traveling there ever since. Really, I think I've made 12 trips into Darfur and the surrounding regions of Chad and Central African Republic, because for me that conflict is very inclusive. I really don't distinguish very much between what's going on in Darfur, what's going on the border of Chad, and also what's going on the borders of Central African Republic. I call that war genocide without borders because I feel that that's exactly what it is. But what I'd kind of like to do right now is to show you, maybe give a voice, a few explanations to some of the pictures that we're going to see later on, but sometimes I feel that it's a little easier to connect, maybe a little bit easier for me to make you a little bit more concerned if you can hear some of the stories behind some of the pictures that you're going to see a little later on. This is one of the camps. This is actually in eastern Chad. This is when thousands and thousands of people run from the Janjaweed, from the attacks for the Sudanese government. These are the places they end up. And earlier on we were hearing about the marketplaces and the DVD stores and the video shops. And they all happen. This is a mini community in here. It's just a small economy, but it shouldn't be there. This is a girl I met. She was huddled underneath a tree in 2003 because she and her mother and the rest of the village that her mother had come, the rest of the village who traveled together were hiding underneath one tree to avoid being detected by the planes that were flying over and bombing the villages. This lady, I was working with an organization called Doctors Without Borders, and we met this lady who had two children, twins, newborn, and because she was forced to flee her village, had a 6-day walk from her village after the Janjaweed attacked. Luckily, she was one of the ones that wasn't captured and raped. But the 6-day walk meant that she arrived in the village, and one of the children was stillborn, and she was left with just one child. And these are the stories these aren't singular stories. These are happening not 10 times, not 20 times. These are happening thousands of times. With every village, with every camp like that, there are thousands of stories like this. This is not isolated cases. The issues of child soldiers are well documented on all sides. This is essentially what happens straight after the Janjaweed have attacked a village. They leave it. This is exactly what is left of your homes. We heard the testimonies earlier on of the families being raped, and they burnt our homes and they left us with nothing. This is what they get. They walk back and this is what they find. This is their home. This is the only thing that's left. This is also, I wanted to put this slide in just because it gives you an indication of how humanitarian workers work there now and used to work there in the past before some of them were thrown out. This is an MSF truck in the middle of an attack on a town in eastern Chad. Actually, this is in a town called Adre. And the bombs are everywhere. The RPGs are landing, and you can see that the military here are rushing towards the front line, and the doctors here are rushing from their residence to the hospital because they know they're going to get quite a lot of admissions in just a few hours. But this is all happening. These doctors are going in there, they're being shot at, they're being bombed. And this is kind of a full war situation. And this is where they get to. This is actually an image of a soldier who's lost quite a significant amount of his intestines, and he's kind of contemplating his future. This is again an attack on a hospital. Ironically, even though in my eyes this shape of this hole, it looks like a dove, a peace dove without a head. It's kind of symbolic for me, but ironically you have this truck which is rushing to the front line with a bunch of fighters. This is one of the most horrific things that is going on in Darfur, the use of these fire bombs or phosphorus bombs, and this is what it does. These things are illegal, these are banned. But the Sudanese government is throwing them out the backs of helicopters, throwing them out the backs of planes. No aim, nothing like that. They just kind of throw them onto the villages, and this is the effect of something so horrific. But one interesting thing that I find quite amazing is the people are so resourceful and so stoic. They just carry on with their lives, their homes. This lady, actually, the village that we saw earlier on, the one with the bed in the middle of it, that was her home. Just a matter of hours after the cinders have stopped smoking, she's rebuilding her home. Very resilient. These are fighters just readying to go to battle. This young boy, 14 years old he'd been in a camp, and this is quite common. He'd been in a camp since he was 11. His father had been killed, his brothers had been killed. He was left in the camp with his mother and his sisters, and was recruited by the SLA to just be a general helper in the military at the age of 11, 12 years old. He was bored, he was angry, he wanted to fight. He wanted to at least sort of be with his people and be with the men of his village so that they could fight against the Khartoum regime. And, he helped, he carried, he cooked, he cleaned. And then one day he asked to be a soldier. He wanted to be a soldier. He wanted to carry a Kalashnikov. They gave him training. He's only 13 at this point. He had a couple of weeks training, and then the day of the battle comes. He's now 14 years old, and he jumps on the back of a pickup truck, many of which we've seen earlier on, and he's so stoned with marijuana because he's so scared. I certainly would be if I was 14 years old and going to the battle for the first time. He falls off the truck runs over his leg, and later his leg's amputated. But this story, again, like the stories that we hear of the mothers of the rape victims, this is not a singular case. This is happening, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of children that this is happening to. I mean, culturally, it's very... it's such a bad thing to lose a limb in the Sudanese culture. They'll fight and fight and fight to keep a limb, so much so that they'll actually endanger their lives through gangrene, through blood poisoning, in order to try and keep a limb. So many, many times, something like this particular foot was gangrenous. It should have been amputated immediately, but he refused to allow the amputation, and his commanders refused to allow the amputation. And actually, 2 weeks later, this child had gangrene so significant that the leg had to be amputated just below the hip, whereas previously he would have just lost his foot. This child has been hit by a bullet straight through the head. This is running off to battle. A lot of the fighting happens either very, very early in the morning, and this is the SLA running off into battle. Again, these are the homes that are left after the attacks. This is actually a Janjaweed looting and kind of looking at me and trying to weigh me up, but he's looting the grain that's left inside the grain storage in the home there. These are the Janjaweed in one of the villages that I was documenting. Just after they'd burnt the village, they kind of came back to loot. And this is, this arid landscape, this is the place they love. This is the place they were happy in before. I mean, it's quite fertile in the rainy season, but this is just after a distribution of food and the family's going back to their home. Crushing of the sorghum to feed their animals. And also, this is the time women going off to collect water, women going off to collect firewood at dusk, or just coming back just as dusk's falling, leaving very early in the morning to collect firewood and water. This is the time when the women are attacked, and not just militia, Janjaweed rebels waiting outside the camps, but also just their own population as well are now doing this in camps very similar to the one we saw at the start. There's no security, there's no judicial process, and so women have a horrific time. But the decision that the family makes, especially in the times when the fighting was going on, is we can send a woman out there because she'll only be raped. If we send a man to get firewood, he'll be killed. And so it's a choice that the family makes. A young boy playing with his father's gun in Adre. This is camp life. This is what happens when the homes are bombed. This village was bombed from the air. I took this picture in 2003, I think December 2003, when the Sudanese government was saying that they were not bombing Darfur, that there were no bombs in Darfur, and flights weren't even going over there. And here we have the evidence. That was a lie. Going off to get water in the camps. This is what happens to young boys. They get left like this as a message. This boy was dragged behind a pickup truck like we saw before with his headdress. He was hanged, essentially through this dragging process. It was tied around his neck. And the bodies are left around the villages after they've been attacked as a message to the other young boys when they come back to maybe collect their belongings, to say, don't get involved in this conflict because this is what's going to happen to you. But still, they join up. Many times when they flee with very, very little. And this lady's actually been waiting for 2 weeks in this situation for aid, for some form of help. And the heat we were talking about earlier on, I don't know what it is in old money, but I call it 47 degrees in the shade. And that's hot, trust me. Again, bodies just left out as a message, calling cards almost. Families struggling just to run, just to flee. Actually, this family had gone back to their village to collect items of clothing, maybe a little bit of food that could have been left after the Janjaweed had been looting. This is an SLA soldier injured in a battle, coming back to the camps, and then going off, running towards the front line to react to a Janjaweed attack in the village. Collecting water in the evening. This is a whole village gathered underneath a tree again, as I said earlier on, to protect themselves from the flights of the planes dropping bombs on villages when they see population. And this is kind of an interesting point, because earlier on we mentioned that families, they lose their wealth, their cattle, their goats, their camels, that's their wealth. And this is a family who's slowly, in their long march out of the killing zones, their livestock have slowly died, their goats have died first, and then their camels die, and they're left with this chunk of their life here, but no way to actually carry that out of where they're left. And then they're left in the middle of nowhere with no way of taking this stuff because they've no livestock left. These are the battle zones. This actually was an area of a huge battle between the Sudanese government and the SLA. Families hiding behind villages, hiding behind bushes. They make their shelters around the bushes just for protection from the wind and the heat. It's an SLA patrol. It's kind of how I traveled on my taxi. And then, the final price, the malnutrition, the lack of access to medication is a fundamental problem, and it causes hundreds of deaths every week. It's because of the lack of access to medication that a lot of the children have a problem, and they just can't get from point A to point B because it's insecure, and they just kind of wait and die. These lines, even when they're in the camps, water's a significant problem, and they can't get hold of enough water to water the population. So over many days, the lines, they grow, and this is actually a queue. They come here, they leave their boudin, their plastic bottles, and come back when the water arrives. So registrations of refugees, the crushing of the sorghum again in the evening. This is that tree I've been talking about. So I saw this so many times traveling through Darfur with these villagers clustered under here, and this is not to stay away from the heat, trust me. This whole village is actually moving in the evening. They walk for 12 hours during the night, and then during the day they sleep under these trees for protection against the planes that are bombing anything that they can see that's moving. Some lucky ones that found a hospital to treat their children. And these are actually these are Arab nomads that can actually travel quite freely between Chad and Darfur, because the war's not about them. These are the people that are not getting expelled from their homes. So there's a population, we think kind of all this Darfur is this empty space. It's not. There are actually quite a lot of Arabs moving into the spaces that the Black Darfurians have been expelled from. And this, for me, it's kind of almost a biblical kind of feel. It's late in the evening, coming back after collecting wood from the spaces outside. So I hope that gives you kind of an understanding. I know we're going to see some pictures later on, but I think sometimes it's easier for me to talk about it so that you can understand just one or two of the stories that we're going to see later on in the auditorium. But thanks very much indeed.
You guys want to come back? We're running a little late on time, but we'll take at least 5 minutes for a Q&A, and just a reminder to come down to the microphones, and then we'll move on to the exhibit. Thank you.
Representative or someone who's not standing for more action?
The answer is we don't know why Obama's appointed Colonel Gratian, except he was a friend of Obama's from before the election. He speaks fluent Swahili, lived in Africa as a missionary child. And it's not some. He would not agree that it's a weak negotiation that he's leading. He would say that he is getting to yes by not attacking the government of Sudan. And that may, he may be right. It may work eventually, but it's not working yet.
Just a quick addition that I don't know if people are aware that just this week a large group of Darfuris in exile called for Obama to ask Gratian to step down. And you'll see it in the news. But they are very disappointed with his policy. And, one of the other it's not just about Gratian, but I think one of the things that many of us who've been sort of Darfur watchers for quite some time have been concerned about is how long it took the administration to develop the so-called Sudan policy. And it's still not really evident what it is. But that's not anything terribly new in terms of how the U.S. has dealt with this crisis, even before President Obama.
Good evening. How do you evaluate the actions of the High Commissariat for Refugees of the United Nations in this conflict?
They have a very difficult job, and as with some of the other UN agencies that are in the position of having the responsibility to respond to a crisis of this magnitude, of this complexity that's gone on this long in this part of the world, they're under-resourced and underfunded, and they have a mandate that's very difficult to carry out, especially on the Chad-Sudan border, and certainly as well, to the extent that they have any role inside, but on the border and on the Chad side, they are responsible for these camps, but it's in an area where it's extremely difficult to deploy. You have to get to N'Djamena, the capital of Chad, and then you have to go all the way across to some of the areas that you saw in Marcus's pictures, and just the sheer logistics of getting help there are overwhelming. And on top of that, there's a lot of turnover. This is what we saw in staff in these sort of hardship posts. And so somebody will be there, a local commander or a local this or that, and they will get something going, and then they'll leave, and then somebody else will come. And there's a lot of complexity of the agencies and how they need to deploy. But on top of that, there's the problem of the Chadian government, and there's cross-border war that's been going on. So they're somewhat hamstrung even as they carry out their mandate. And to a great extent, Chadian military and police have a lot of authority and control around these camps, and also, at least from what we assessed, are involved inside as well, sometimes in nefarious ways. So, we have raised our concerns about Chad in particular with UNHCR, and I don't think all the responses have been satisfactory, but we sort of understand the enormous challenge that they have. I don't know if you have other observations.
I think the initial response in 2003, 2004 is probably one of the, I've worked in conflict zones for 15, 16 years, and it's probably one of the worst I've seen. It was underfunded, lack of expertise, lack of will, actually, political will at some points. It was almost as if they didn't care for many, many months. I was working there from the end of 2003 until May 2004, living in Darfur, and very rarely did I see anything significant. The people that you saw was waiting underneath these wisps of cloth put together with a few twigs. They were waiting there for months. And actually, personally, I find it atrocious that the international community did at that point what it did, which was absolute lack of reaction and massively underfunded a conflict in a zone where they could have done a lot more, and they could do a lot more now too. I think, as already been mentioned, these places are pretty awful, and it's not a great posting, and people don't stay there for very long, and this whole staff turnover is a huge problem. Theft as well is a huge problem. Corruption is a huge problem. Manipulation by the military and the local police is a huge problem. So Yeah, they can definitely do a better job, is my point, I think.
I just wanted to ask you to look forward a little bit, maybe with some misplaced optimism, but what are the opportunities here for any kind of post-conflict justice or resolution, particularly dealing with non-state and semi-state actors, and actually particularly in the context of the extensive sexual violence?
Well, I mean, it's really interesting. This is the first, at the international levels, the first warrant against a sitting head of state. So how that will play out is anybody's guess. There doesn't seem to be a lot of oomph behind actually doing anything that might actually involve arresting not only Bashir, but also the others who now have warrants for their arrest. And there is also a member of one of the rebel movements who's gotten a warrant as well. At the local level or the domestic level in terms of rape, been several of our colleagues have done deep analyses of the challenges of prosecuting rape in Sudan. Sudanese law makes it almost impossible to successfully prosecute rape. You have to have 4 male eyewitnesses to a rape or 8 female eyewitnesses. That obviously almost never occurs, certainly in these circumstances. On top of that, you have to know who the perpetrator is, their identity, where they are, and of course there's no physical evidence that's really going to be found. The women that we interviewed in Chad, almost all of them who reported being raped had never told a single other person before they talked to our doctors, and many of the rapes had occurred 4 to 5 years earlier. So there's an enormous stigma. Many of the women had been shunned. They had been sent away from their homes. Very often women are accused of adultery or defilement and so forth, and blamed for the crime even when the family knows the circumstances. And if they're not married, they're often considered unmarriageable. So there's an enormous stigma and obstacle to reporting or telling anyone that you've been the victim of a rape. So, I think eventually what's interesting is that for the first time it's being discussed in this population. Some women are talking about it even publicly, which is almost unheard of. There are huge numbers of women-headed households, female-headed households in the refugee and IDP population because men are either killed or they're out farming or fighting. And so this Varshana Manifesto, which discusses sexual violence, but also quite a lot of other women's rights in terms of age of marriage and division of labor and having more role in policy and so forth, even in the camps, is really almost a revolutionary thing. But it's going to take a very, very long time for things to change. There are strong women's movements or organizations in Khartoum. I think many of these are also going to be somewhat suppressed now because many of them also have views that are in opposition to the current regime on top of being interested in women's rights. And as you may have seen recently, there's this very well-known case about the women wearing pants in Sudan and so forth being prosecuted. And so, I think it's a burgeoning change. It's going to take many decades, but in the long run, I'm hopeful there will be change because it's inevitable.
Quick question. What do you see are the roles of NGOs versus governments versus the UN or international entities? I know that all of you seem to have worked for NGOs, and Professor Rotberg, you were talking about the need to have one central peace effort as opposed to many. There are lots of efforts going on. What do you see as the different roles of these different types of entities?
The government of the Sudan is not amenable to the usual kinds of pressures, so it has to be government to government for the most part. The Security Council has to play a major role. The European Union, the US, and so on can do a lot. But with China in the picture, it really has to be government to government. And NGOs are always very helpful, always very useful, particularly the ones in Khartoum, as well as in Darfur. Some of them have done amazing things. And Marcus was talking about the NGOs on the ground who were doing relief when they were allowed in, and some have been allowed back in. All very important, but the real issue is at the highest level to bring the government of Sudan to account.
I'd like to thank our speakers one more time for coming here and sharing with us today. Unfortunately, don't have any time for any more questions right now, but hopefully they'll be able to stay around for a little bit afterwards and maybe address any questions other people have. Before we head out to the exhibit, I'd like to introduce Leslie Thomas, who is the architect and curator who created the Darfur project out of a desire to bring the individual faces of the humanitarian crisis in Western Sudan and Eastern Chad to the world. It's exhibited at such venues as the Los Angeles Hammer, the Boston ICA, the Royal Ontario Museum, the Jewish Museum in Berlin, and Forma in Milan. During that time, the exhibit has brought its large-scale projections to the streets of the world's major cultural centers. A founding principle with LARC Incorporated and LARC Studio, a national architectural practice based in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles, Ms. Thomas is a graduate of Columbia University and the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, a National Endowment for the Arts awardee, and an Emmy Award-winning art director. She is also committed to the use of design and media for social change. Projects in development include the exhibit's Bodies of Water and an untitled traveling project highlighting the extreme violence against women in the Democratic Republic of Congo. For the exhibit, the way you get there is go out of these doors and you turn to the right, and there will be people out there to guide you as you find your way to the exhibit.
We probably need to change the website. The exhibit on about the Democratic Republic of Congo is called Congo Women. It features and was inspired by work taken by Marcus Bleasdale, and can be seen at the United Nations right now. Just very quickly, I wanted to say that we have a 10-minute story, and it's a story told by Lynsey Addario, Marcus, Mark Brecke, Helene Caux, Ron Haviv, James Nachtwey, Paolo Pellegrin, Ryan Spencer-Reid, Michal Safdie, and Brian Steidle. And it will take you through life in villages, war, life as a refugee, fighting, and what it means to be in Darfur now and Chad. It'll be 10 people's visions of what Marcus very carefully shared with us tonight. Very different, very comprehensive, we hope. And we would invite you to watch it and to be angry and then to act and try to stop this. And so if you follow the directions out there, we'd like to do that with you. Thank you.